It's the early 19th century. The young United States is hungry for expansion, driven by the belief in manifest destiny, the idea that it is their divine right to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Meanwhile, Mexico, a nation still reeling from its hard-fought independence from Spain, is struggling to maintain control over its vast, unstable territory. These two forces were on a collision course that would erupt into one of the most consequential wars in North American history, the Mexican-American War. By 1830, Mexico had been independent for nearly a decade, but the scars of revolution had left the country in complete disarray. Without a clear roadmap for governance, political instability reigned. Various factions vied for power, internal rebellions erupted, and the looming threat of a Spanish attempt to reclaim Mexico added to the chaos. The nation's sheer size, stretching over 4.5 million square kilometers, made it incredibly difficult to govern effectively, and many territories on the periphery began seeking independence. Meanwhile, the United States was booming. Having recently acquired the vast Louisiana territory from France, it was rapidly expanding westward. This expansion put it on a direct path toward conflict with Mexico, particularly in the region of Texas. Mexico had initially encouraged American settlers to populate Texas, hoping they would help develop the region. But over time, tensions grew as these settlers, mostly from the southern United States, brought slaves into the territory, something that clashed with Mexico's anti-slavery policies. The situation escalated when Texas declared independence from Mexico in 1836, sparking the famous battles at the Alamo and San Jacinto. Mexico refused to recognize Texas as an independent republic, but the U.S. saw an opportunity. When James K. Polk won the presidency in 1844, he championed an aggressive expansionist agenda, determined to bring Texas, California, and the entire Southwest into the Union. The annexation of Texas became official on December 29, 1845, making it the 28th U.S. state. But to Mexico, this was nothing short of an act of war. The conflict escalated over the unclear Texas-Mexico border. The United States claimed the Rio Grande as the southern border, while Mexico insisted it was the Nueces River, about 150 miles north. To assert its claim, President Polk ordered U.S. troops, led by General Zachary Taylor, to move into the disputed area, essentially baiting Mexico into an attack. On April 25, 1846, Mexican cavalry ambushed an American patrol, killing 11 soldiers. Polk seized the moment, declaring to Congress that Mexico has shed American blood on American soil. War was officially declared on May 13, 1846, though Mexico never issued a formal declaration of its own. The first significant clashes occurred at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, where General Taylor's forces repelled the Mexican army. But the war was far from over. The U.S. had superior artillery, better logistics, and a more unified government. But Mexico had the advantage of fighting on home soil and was led by an unpredictable yet experienced commander, General Antonio López de Santa Anna. Santa Anna was one of the most controversial figures in Mexican history. A skilled political opportunist, he had once opposed Mexico's independence before later supporting it. He had exiled himself multiple times, only to return and reclaim power repeatedly. At the outbreak of war, Santa Anna was in exile in Cuba. He made a deal with U.S. officials. He promised to negotiate a peaceful settlement if they allowed him to return to Mexico. But as soon as he was back, he double-crossed the Americans, took control of the Mexican army, and prepared for war. While Taylor was engaging Mexican forces in the north, General Stephen Kearny led an American force westward, seizing New Mexico and California with little resistance. Meanwhile, U.S. naval forces under Commodore John D. Sloat blockaded Mexico's Pacific ports and captured Los Angeles, Monterey, and San Francisco. In response, Mexican resistance fighters launched the Taos Revolt, a desperate attempt to push back against U.S. occupation in New Mexico. But American forces quickly crushed the uprising, further cementing their control. In September 1846, Taylor's army advanced south, clashing with Mexican forces at Monterey. The battle was brutal, with U.S. troops unfamiliar with urban warfare. Fighting raged street by street, house by house, but ultimately, Taylor's forces took the city. Then came the Battle of Buena Vista in February 1847. Santa Anna, leading an army of 15,000 men, launched a massive assault against Taylor's force of 4,600 Americans. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the Americans held firm. The turning point came when U.S. artillery devastated Mexican ranks, forcing Santa Anna to retreat. This was a major blow to Mexico's war effort, but the most decisive phase of the war was yet to come. Polk, unsatisfied with Taylor's cautious advance, ordered General Winfield Scott to launch an amphibious assault on Veracruz, Mexico's most important port. In March 1847, Scott's forces landed and besieged the city, bombarding it relentlessly until Mexican forces surrendered. From Veracruz, Scott marched inland toward Mexico City, following the same path that Hernán Cortés had taken during the Spanish conquest centuries earlier. Santa Anna attempted to halt the Americans at Cerro Gordo, but Scott's forces outflanked the Mexican army, forcing them to retreat. By August, the Americans were at the gates of Mexico City. After a series of bloody battles, including the infamous fight at Chapultepec Castle, where young Mexican cadets, later known as the Niños Héroes, fought to the death rather than surrender, U.S. forces entered the Mexican capital on September 14, 1847. The war was effectively over. With Mexico City under American control, negotiations began. On February 2, 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed. The terms were devastating for Mexico. The U.S. acquired California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, a staggering 55% of Mexico's pre-war territory. The Rio Grande was officially recognized as the Texas-Mexico border. In return, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million, a fraction of the land's true value. The war was over, but its consequences rippled through history. The massive land gains for the U.S. accelerated tensions between North and South as debates erupted over whether slavery would be allowed in the new territories, a dispute that would eventually lead to the Civil War. Mexico was left politically and economically devastated, and resentment toward the U.S. festered for generations. For the U.S., military officers who fought in this war, such as Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, would later become key figures in the Civil War. The Mexican-American War was a defining moment in the history of both nations, one that shaped borders, fueled political tensions, and left lasting scars. What started as a territorial dispute between an expanding United States and an unstable Mexico escalated into a full-scale war that would alter the course of history. For the United States, it was a war of expansion, manifest destiny in full motion. With President James K. Polk at the helm, the U.S. government was determined to seize new lands, stretching its influence from the Atlantic to the Pacific. The war allowed the United States to acquire vast territories, including present-day California, Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, Utah, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. This territorial expansion would later fuel tensions between the North and South over the spread of slavery, contributing to the fractures that led to the American Civil War. For Mexico, the war was a national tragedy. Already struggling with internal conflicts, weak governance, and economic instability, the country found itself unable to mount an effective defense against the superior U.S. military forces. The loss of nearly half its territory was a devastating blow, one that left deep wounds in Mexican society. To this day, the war remains a painful chapter in Mexican history, remembered as a symbol of loss and injustice. One of the most controversial aspects of the war was the way it began. Was it a justified response to Mexican aggression, as President Polk claimed? Or was it a calculated move to provoke conflict, as Ulysses S. Grant and other critics suggested? The historical debate continues, with many historians arguing that the war was an unnecessary act of aggression by a stronger nation against a weaker one. The war also had significant military implications. It was one of the first large-scale conflicts where modern warfare tactics, such as amphibious landings and urban combat, played a major role. It also served as a proving ground for future Civil War leaders, including Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, and Stonewall Jackson, who all gained valuable combat experience during the conflict. Beyond the battlefield, the war had profound diplomatic consequences. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, officially ended the war and forced Mexico to cede its northern territories to the United States. In return, the U.S. paid Mexico $15 million, a fraction of the land's true value. The treaty established the modern U.S.-Mexico border, but tensions between the two nations remained high for decades. The war also had a lasting impact on the people living in the newly acquired territories. Thousands of Mexicans suddenly found themselves living under U.S. rule, facing discrimination, land seizures, and political exclusion. Native American groups in these territories also suffered, as U.S. expansion further encroached on their lands and way of life. Ultimately, the Mexican-American War was a conflict driven by ambition, politics, and territorial hunger. It cemented the United States as a dominant power in North America, but left a legacy of resentment and hardship for Mexico. It serves as a stark reminder of how power struggles, border disputes, and political maneuvering can shape the destiny of entire nations. And that's the story of the Mexican-American War, one of the most pivotal yet often overlooked conflicts in history. But history isn't just about the past. It's about understanding how events shape the present and influence the future. What do you think? Was the war an inevitable consequence of expansion, or could it have been avoided? Was it a justified conflict or an act of aggression? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most fascinating wars and conflicts, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.